10 years after divorce, Billionaire unexpectedly meets his ex-wife and discovers his son's long-lost twins. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to our one and only channel where we share tales that touch the heart and soul. Oh, how I've missed you all. How have you been since our last story together? I hope life has been kind and generous to you. Each day away from you felt like forever, and I cannot express how much joy it brings me to be back here with you today. The connection we share is so special, and I treasure each moment we spend together through these stories. Your presence here means everything to me. Let's take a moment for something truly special, a beautiful prayer before we begin. Heavenly Father, I come before you with a heart full of gratitude for every single member of this family. Lord, bless my wonderful viewers, my loyal supporters, and everyone who finds joy, comfort, and love in this space. Whatever they're going through, Father, lift them up. Fill their hearts with peace, their minds with wisdom, and their lives with endless joy. May their dreams come true, may their struggles turn into victories, and may they always feel surrounded by love. Amen. My dear family, I want to offer my deepest apology for not posting a new story for a while now. The truth is, I've been feeling unwell due to stress and inadequate sleep. My doctor actually recommended that I take 3 weeks of complete rest to recover properly. During this time away, you were constantly in my thoughts. Every day, I found myself wanting to reach out, to share another story, to connect with you all again. I couldn't wait to get back and be with you because you truly are my family. There's a special warmth that fills my heart whenever I share these tales of love with you. It's a feeling that cannot be replaced by anything else in this world. Your patience during this time means more to me than you know, and I'm so grateful to be back here with you today, recovering and ready to share once again. My beautiful family, if you could spare a moment in your day, please say a word of prayer for me. Your kind words and thoughtful prayers mean the world to me and give me strength during these challenging times. A simple "get well soon" in the comments would warm my heart completely. From the bottom of my heart, thank you all for your continued support through this journey. Your likes, comments, shares, and subscription has been my motivation to keep create these stories for you. While on my rest bed, my wife, who is also a loyal supporter, has been going through your reactions and was reading your thoughtful comments to me. It warmed my heart so much and reminded me why I started this channel. Your engagement is what keeps me going even during difficult times. The way you connect with these characters and their journeys touches me deeply. Please keep supporting this family. It's your love that transforms these tales from mere words into a beautiful experience we share together. Today, you're about to witness how one man's ambition cost him everything that truly mattered, and how fate gave him an unexpected opportunity to confront the past he thought he'd left behind. It's a tale of regret, revelation, and the possibility of redemption. So, quickly hit that like button and subscribe if you've not done that yet, because today's story is one that will stay with you long after our time together ends. Grab your favorite snack, settle in, and let's begin this emotional journey together. Alexander Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse office, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the city that had bent to his will. At 45, the self-made tech billionaire had become a legend in the business world. His company, Pierce Innovations, had revolutionized quantum computing and artificial intelligence integration, making him one of the wealthiest men in America. The Wall Street Journal had called him ruthlessly brilliant. Forbes had named him the man who saw tomorrow. His competitors simply called him the machine for his analytical mind and tireless work ethic. His office reflected his character, minimalist, functional, with nothing out of place. No family photos adorned his desk. No personal touches softened the sleek, modern space. Everything served a purpose, just as everyone in his life did. Alexander checked his Patek Philippe watch, a rare indulgence he permitted himself, before turning back to the holographic display showing Pierce Innovations' latest stock surge. The numbers were impressive, as always. Yet something in his eyes, a fleeting emptiness quickly masked by determination, suggested that all his success had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. 10 years earlier, Alexander Pierce wasn't yet a household name. At 35, he was the hungry founder of a promising tech startup, working out of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn. The space buzzed with energy day and night, mostly because Alexander seldom left. His cot in the back office saw more use than his downtown apartment. "We're close to a breakthrough," he'd tell his small team of equally dedicated engineers. "One more push and we'll change the world." This wasn't empty motivation, Alexander truly believed it. His vision for integrating quantum computing into everyday devices wasn't just ambitious, industry experts deemed it nearly impossible. But impossibility only fueled Alexander's determination. 80-hour workweeks became his standard. He survived on protein bars, coffee, and 4 hours of sleep. Holidays passed unnoticed. Weekends disappeared. Time itself became merely another resource to exploit in pursuit of his vision. His competitors failed to see what he saw. Investors doubted him. "Pierce is brilliant but impractical," they whispered. "He's chasing a fantasy." Yet when others stepped back, Alexander pushed forward, sacrificing everything for success. Most evenings found him hunched over schematics until 3 a.m., eyes red-rimmed but alert. His phone constantly buzzed with missed calls, his wife, friends, occasionally his doctor warning about his blood pressure. All ignored. "You need balance," his mentor had warned. Alexander had simply smiled. Balance is for people who accept mediocrity. During one particular development sprint, Alexander didn't leave the office for 11 days straight. His team rotated in shifts, but he remained constant, sleeping only when his body demanded it. When they finally achieved their first successful prototype integration, Alexander didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and said, "Now we scale it." The real work, in his mind, had only just begun. While Alexander chased his technological dreams, Sophia Pierce lived in a different reality. At 28, the former art gallery curator had put her own career on hold to support her husband's vision. Their elegant brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, chosen for its proximity to Alexander's warehouse office, had slowly transformed from their shared home into her solitary confinement. Sophia had once believed in Alexander's dreams as fervently as he did. "You'll change the world," she'd told him on late nights when doubt crept in. She'd been his sounding board, his refuge, his most trusted advisor. But as Pierce Innovations gained momentum, Alexander retreated further into his work, leaving Sophia to navigate her pregnancy alone. At 6 months along, her slender frame had blossomed with new life. She decorated the nursery herself, choosing a gender-neutral palette of soft yellows and greens. Each evening, she set the dining table for two, lighting candles that often burned to stubs as she ate alone, watching the door Alexander rarely walked through before midnight. Her friends gradually stopped calling after too many cancelled plans. "He needs me to be understanding right now," she'd explain, making excuses for his absence at dinner parties and baby showers. Her parents worried from afar, their video calls revealing the growing shadows beneath their daughter's eyes. Sophia kept a journal, writing letters to her unborn child about the brilliant father who would surely be more present once the baby arrived. "He's building something important," she wrote, "something that will give you a better world." But as weeks of solitude stretched into months, her handwriting grew less certain, her words less convinced. Each morning, she placed her hand on her growing belly and whispered reassurances to the baby or to herself. She wasn't always sure. He'll come around. He has to. The rain tapped steadily against the windows of their brownstone as Sophia paced the living room floor. The clock read 11:37 p.m. early by Alexander's standards. When the front door finally opened, she rushed toward the entryway, calendar in hand. "You're home," she said, relief washing over her tired features. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. Alexander nodded distractedly, already scrolling through emails on his phone. "Just for a few hours. We're reconfiguring the quantum processor tonight. I need to shower and grab a fresh shirt." Sophia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Alex, I have an important ultrasound tomorrow at 2 p.m. Dr. Mercer says everything looks good, but this is the detailed anatomy scan. They'll check all the baby's organs, measurements." Her voice trailed off as Alexander continued typing on his phone. "Alex," she tried again, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Please look at me." He glanced up, his expression softening momentarily at the sight of her expanded belly. "I'm listening. I need you to come with me tomorrow. Just this once. I've been to every appointment alone." The receptionist has started giving me pitying looks. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm not asking you to cut back your hours permanently. Just one afternoon. 2 hours of your time." Alexander checked his watch. "Tomorrow at 2. That's right, when we're meeting with potential investors." "Reschedule them," Sophia pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please. I'm carrying your child. I shouldn't have to beg you to be involved. The investors are flying in from Tokyo specifically to meet me," Alexander replied, his tone softening though his resolve remained firm. "You know how crucial this funding round is. We're so close to breakthrough." Sophia stepped back, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "It's always so close, or just one more week. For months now." Alexander ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, exhaustion and frustration evident in every line of his face. "What do you want me to say? That I'll abandon years of work when we're on the verge of something revolutionary?" "I want you to say our family matters too," Sophia whispered. "Everything I do is for us." Alexander's voice rose as he gestured to their elegant home. "I'm building an empire for us. For our child. Can't you understand that? This isn't just about money, it's about creating a legacy." Sophia's eyes flashed with unexpected anger. "A legacy? Your child is your legacy, Alexander. Not some company, not some technology that will be outdated in a decade." "You're being emotional and short-sighted," Alexander said, checking his watch again. "My work will change the world. Millions of families will benefit from what we're creating. Surely you can handle a few doctor's appointments on your own." The dismissive tone in his voice hung in the air between them, transforming the space from a home into a battleground. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Sophia's eyes, resilience hardening into resolve. The following day, Sophia sat alone in the dimly lit examination room, her eyes fixed on the monitor as Dr. Mercer moved the ultrasound wand across her belly. "Wait," Dr. Mercer said, adjusting the equipment. "Let me check something." Sophia's heart raced. "Is something wrong with the baby?" A gentle smile spread across Dr. Mercer's face. Not at all. In fact, Ms. Pierce, do you see this? She pointed to the screen. And here? Her finger moved slightly. Sophia squinted at the grainy images. Congratulations, Dr. Mercer said warmly. You're having twins. The world seemed to stop. Twins? Sophia whispered, tears filling her eyes. Joy and terror mingled in her chest as she stared at the two distinct shapes on the screen, two hearts beating, two little lives growing inside her. Her hand instinctively reached to the empty chair beside her, finding only cold metal where Alexander should have been. This moment, this life-changing revelation, and he had chosen to be elsewhere. As Dr. Mercer printed the ultrasound images, Sophia felt a profound loneliness wash over her. Two babies. Twice the love, twice the work, twice the responsibility. And still, she was alone. Would you like to know the genders? Dr. Mercer asked, gently taking her off her thoughts. That evening, Sophia waited. She set the dining table with care, placing the ultrasound photos beside Alexander's plate. Two candles burned steadily as the clock ticked past 8 p.m. 9 p.m. 10 p.m. When Alexander finally arrived home at 11:30, Sophia sat motionless at the table, the candles burned to stubs, her face composed but eyes red-rimmed. You missed dinner, she said quietly as he dropped his keys on the counter. Had a breakthrough with the investors. They're in. His voice held triumph until he noticed her expression. What's wrong? Wordlessly, Sophia pushed the ultrasound photos toward him. We're having twins. 2 boys. Alexander froze, picking up the images. Twins? For a moment, genuine wonder crossed his features. I had no idea. You would have if you'd been there. Alexander set the photos down. Sophia, you know I would have come if I could, but... Stop. Her voice was calm but firm. I won't do this anymore, Alex. I won't raise these children alone while being technically married. Either make time for your family or there won't be one waiting for you. The air between them grew heavy with the weight of her words, not a threat but a boundary long overdue. Alexander remained standing, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder, more calculated. The businessman replacing the husband. What exactly are you asking for, Sophia? That I abandon everything I've worked for? The company is at a critical junction. We've just secured Series B funding. The next 6 months will determine whether we succeed or fail. I'm asking for a husband who shows up. A father who will be present, Sophia replied, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Not someone who treats his family like an afterthought. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the ultrasound photos to his wife's face. When he spoke, his voice was measured, detached. I can't give you what you're asking for. Not now. Maybe in a year, when the company is stable. A year? Sophia interrupted. Our sons will be walking by then. Alexander straightened his shoulders. Maybe that's for the best. I can't be the husband or father you want right now. I won't pretend otherwise. The words landed between them like shattered glass. Sophia's breath caught as she realized he wasn't fighting for them, he was choosing to let them go. You don't mean that, she whispered. 2 weeks later, exhaustion and stress took their toll. Sophia collapsed in the nursery while arranging tiny matching outfits in freshly assembled dresses. Her neighbor, who had come by with a home-cooked meal, found her unconscious and called an ambulance. At 32 weeks pregnant with twins, Sophia was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital with dangerously high blood pressure and signs of preeclampsia. The doctors moved quickly, administering medication to stabilize her condition and steroids to help the twins' lungs develop in case of premature delivery. "We need to keep you here for observation," Dr. Mercer explained, her face grave. "The babies are at risk, and so are you. Complete bed rest is necessary." Sophia nodded weakly, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone to call Alexander. The call went straight to voicemail. She texted him the hospital information, adding, "Please come. The babies might come early." Hours passed. Night fell. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting monitors that tracked the twins' heartbeats. Still no Alexander. On the third morning of her hospital stay, as Sophia dozed between nurse checks, a sharp knock at the door roused her. Hope fluttered in her chest. Alexander had finally come. Instead, a courier entered, his expression uncomfortable as he took in the hospital room, the medical equipment, Sophia's vulnerable state. "Mrs. Pierce? I have a delivery that requires your signature." With shaking hands, Sophia opened the manila envelope. Inside were divorce papers, Alexander's signature already on every required line. A separate note, typed on Pierce Innovations' letterhead, explained that all financial arrangements had been made. She would receive a generous settlement, child support, the brownstone. Everything except what she had actually wanted, her husband by her side. The following day, as Sophia's condition worsened and doctors prepared for an emergency C-section, a tall man in an expensive suit appeared at her hospital room door. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm Jonathan Wells from Blackstone Legal. I represent your husband." Sophia stared at him through tears, a contraction gripping her body. The monitor beside her bed beeped with increasing urgency. Alexander sent his lawyer? She managed between labored breaths. Wells adjusted his tie uncomfortably. "Mr. Pierce wanted me to inform you that he's in the middle of critical negotiations in California. He's arranged for all medical expenses to be covered, of course." A nurse rushed in, checking Sophia's vitals. Her blood pressure's spiking. "We need to prep for surgery now." As they wheeled Sophia toward the operating room, Wells called after her. "Mr. Pierce also wanted me to convey that he wishes you and the children well, and has authorized me to handle any paperwork regarding the birth certificates." Sophia's last conscious thought before anesthesia took hold was the cold realization that Alexander had reduced the birth of his sons to a business transaction, something to be delegated to employees while he attended to more important matters. The door to the operating room swung shut, leaving Alexander's representative standing alone in the empty hallway. "My beautiful family, seeing Sophia's heartbreak reminds me of how love can sometimes blind us to reality. Which makes me want to ask, have you ever been in the same position like Sophia, where you tried to hold on to someone you thought would be your forever, making excuses for them, only for them to shatter your heart in the end? Those moments when you keep believing they'll change, that they'll finally see your worth, but instead they walk away when you need them most. Let me know your experiences in the comments below. Trust me, I read every one of them. You know, sometimes what feels like an ending today always actually end up making space for the love we truly deserve. 10 years later, Alexander Pierce stood in his expansive office at Pierce Innovations headquarters, staring at the newly delivered copy of Forbes. His own face looked back at him from the cover, perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, calculated smile, eyes that revealed nothing. The headline read, "America's Most Innovative CEO, How Alexander Pierce Redefined Tech and Became the $40 billion Man." The article praised his relentless vision and uncompromising standards. It detailed the quantum computing breakthroughs that had transformed Pierce Innovations from a promising startup into a tech giant. There were quotes from industry leaders calling him the next Steve Jobs and her once-in-a-generation genius. The writer had painted him as a modern king, ruling over a digital empire. What the glossy pages didn't show were the 18-hour days, the meals eaten alone at his desk, the personal assistant who reminded him of his mother's birthday because he would certainly forget. They didn't mention how he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without calculation or the fact that he slept with his phone beside his pillow. Alexander placed the magazine on his desk, face down. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see Manhattan stretching before him, the city that now contained more than a dozen buildings housing Pierce Innovations offices and labs. His technology was in millions of devices worldwide. His wealth had grown to the point of abstraction. At 45, Alexander Pierce had achieved everything he had ever worked for. His name was synonymous with innovation. His company had changed how the world processed information. The algorithm he had developed at 35 was now the foundation for artificial intelligence systems across the globe. By every measurable metric, he had won. So why did victory feel so hollow? That evening, Alexander entered his penthouse on the 78th floor of a Central Park-adjacent building that had cost him $42 million. The automated system recognized his presence, lights gradually illuminating the 7,000 square feet of minimalist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the park, a perfect rectangle of managed nature amid the urban landscape. The space was immaculate, cleaned daily by staff who came and went without ever seeing its owner. The kitchen with its Italian marble countertops remained unused except by his personal chef, who prepared meals and left them with precise reheating instructions. The dining table that could seat 16 had never hosted a dinner party. Alexander moved through the rooms with practiced detachment. The living area featured furniture selected by an acclaimed designer, pieces chosen for their aesthetic rather than comfort. The walls displayed museum-quality art that he rarely noticed anymore. In the bedroom, Alexander removed his watch and placed it in its designated spot. He changed into workout clothes and entered his private gym, the only room where he truly felt at home in this massive space. The penthouse was a showpiece, a trophy, a status symbol, everything except what it was supposed to be: a home. 5 years earlier had marked the turning point, the acquisition that transformed Alexander Pierce from merely wealthy to obscenely rich. Microsoft had approached with an offer to purchase Pierce Innovations' quantum encryption algorithm for $12 billion. The board had celebrated, investors had rejoiced, but Alexander had refused. "We're not selling," he had announced at the emergency board meeting, silencing the room. Not the algorithm, not the company, not a single patent. Instead, he had proposed something bolder: Pierce Innovations would license the technology while retaining ownership and control. He wanted to build an ecosystem, not cash out. The board members had exchanged nervous glances as Alexander laid out his vision for expansion. He wasn't just protecting his creation, he was planning domination. The negotiations had been brutal. For 3 months, Alexander barely left the office, sleeping on his couch between marathon strategy sessions. His legal team had begged for compromises, he refused every one. When Microsoft finally agreed to his terms, a 20-year licensing agreement worth $18 billion plus royalties, the business world had been stunned. The day the contracts were signed, Pierce Innovation stock soared 340%. Alexander's personal net worth crossed the billion-dollar threshold before noon. By market close, financial analysts were scrambling to redefine what Pierce Innovations represented in the tech landscape. That evening, his executive team had gathered for champagne. To Alexander Pierce, his CFO had toasted, the man who outmaneuvered Microsoft. Everyone had laughed, glasses clinking. Alexander had smiled and sipped his champagne, feeling nothing but the next target forming in his mind. While his team celebrated, he had slipped away to his office to draft plans for their quantum computing initiative. Success was never a destination for Alexander Pierce, merely a milestone on an endless road. The November rain fell in sheets across Manhattan, reflecting the neon lights of the city in puddles that seemed to swallow the sidewalks whole. Brenda Perkins rushed down Fifth Avenue, clipboard clutched to her chest, cursing under her breath as she dodged pedestrians. At 27, she had already perfected the art of moving through New York like water, fluid, unstoppable, and always racing against time. Yes, Mrs. Matthijs, I understand the orchids must be Cattleya and not Phalaenopsis, she said into her earpiece, mentally adding another $3,000 to the already bloated budget for tomorrow's charity gala. I've personally spoken to the florist, and the substitution will be completed by morning. Brenda checked her watch, 6:42 p.m. She had exactly 18 minutes to reach the venue, confirm the final seating arrangements, and call Alexander with updates. As executive assistant to Alexander Pierce, she knew failure wasn't an option. Tomorrow's Children's Education Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, and Pierce Innovations' $5 million donation required everything to be flawless. Her phone buzzed with Alexander's message, sending the jet for Tokyo investors. Need full briefing on gala by 8 p.m. Brenda quickened her pace. The CEO's demands never stopped, and neither did she. Back in his office, Alexander stared at the quarterly report numbers glowing on his screen. Another record-breaking quarter, revenue up 22%, stock price at an all-time high, market share expanded in every sector. By any objective measure, Pierce Innovations was thriving beyond even his ambitious projections. Yet as he scrolled through the data, Alexander felt a strange hollowness expanding within him. The sensation had been growing for months now, a quiet, persistent emptiness that no business victory seemed capable of filling. He closed the report and walked to the window. Night had fallen over Manhattan, the city transformed into a grid of lights and shadows. Somewhere among those millions of illuminated windows were people celebrating achievements far smaller than his. Were they happier? Alexander rubbed his temples, annoyed by the direction of his thoughts. He had never been one for philosophical musings or existential questions. Goals, strategies, execution, these were the framework of his world. But lately, unbidden moments of doubt had begun to intrude. The question "what next?" had transformed into a more unsettling "what for?" Each new success felt increasingly similar to the last, like variations of the same meal that no longer satisfied his hunger. Alexander turned away from the window, irritated by his own restlessness. He had everything. Why wasn't it enough? You've mentioned this feeling of emptiness several times now, Dr. Harmon observed, his voice calm and measured. The penthouse office where Alexander took his weekly therapy sessions overlooked the Hudson River, the water dark and reflective in the afternoon light. Alexander shifted in his chair. These sessions had been his board's suggestion after he'd fired 3 department heads in a single day. Company policy, they'd said. Executive wellness program. He'd agreed only to appease them. It's not emptiness, Alexander countered. It's restlessness. I need new challenges. Dr. Harmon made a note on his pad. You've conquered every professional challenge you've set for yourself. Pierce Innovations is a global leader. You're personally worth more than the GDP of several countries. Yet you work 16-hour days as if you're still proving yourself. Your point? Alexander asked, glancing at his watch. Have you considered that you might be trying to fill a void with work? That perhaps this drive isn't about achievement anymore, but avoidance? Alexander's jaw tightened. Avoidance of what? That's what we need to explore, Dr. Harmon replied gently. What are you not allowing yourself to think about? What part of your life have you left undeveloped while building your empire? Alexander stood abruptly. Time's up. The Children's Education Foundation specifically requested your presence, Mr. Pierce, Brenda explained, placing the invitation on his desk. They're honoring you as their largest corporate donor. Alexander frowned, scrolling through his calendar. Just do what we always do. Send the donation, issue the press release, have marketing select a suitable executive to represent me. Brenda hesitated. Sir, they've named a scholarship program after you. The foundation chair was quite clear that your physical presence would significantly impact additional donations from other attendees. So they're using me to extract money from my peers, Alexander said dryly. It's for disadvantaged children's education, Brenda reminded him gently. Alexander drummed his fingers on his desk, weighing the disruption to his schedule against the publicity benefits. An education charity was on brand for Pierce Innovations' public image. Knowledge and innovation were their core values, after all. Fine, he conceded reluctantly. Block the evening. Have communications draft appropriate remarks. 3 minutes, maximum. And inform security I'll need a detail. Brenda nodded, hiding her surprise at his acquiescence. And Brenda, he added as she turned to leave, make sure my donation is anonymous this time. No names on scholarships. She paused. May I ask why? Just do it, he said, turning back to his screen and effectively ending the conversation. The quarterly board meeting had concluded with unanimous approval of Alexander's aggressive expansion plans. As executives gathered their materials and engaged in post-meeting small talk, Alexander found himself cornered by Margaret Chen, the 70-year-old venture capitalist who'd backed Pierce Innovations from the beginning. Brilliant presentation as always, Alexander, she said, her shrewd eye studying him. But I've noticed something concerning. Our Asian market penetration? We're addressing that with the new Tokyo office. Margaret waved his comment away. Not business. You. When was the last time you took a vacation? Had dinner with friends? Dated someone? From across the room, Richard Blackwood, another longtime board member, joined them. She's right, Pierce. We were just discussing it. 10 years building this company, and none of us can recall you mentioning any personal milestones. Alexander's expression remained neutral. My personal life isn't relevant to company performance. Disagree, Margaret countered. Leadership longevity is crucial for investor confidence. Burnout is real, even for you. And frankly, Richard added, lowering his voice, potential partners like to see stability in all aspects of a CEO's life. The lone wolf genius narrative only carries you so far. I appreciate your concern, Alexander replied stiffly. If you'll excuse me, I have calls waiting. Late that night, long after his staff had departed, Alexander sat alone in his office. The city lights cast shadows across his face as he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, the only drawer he personally kept locked. From it, he withdrew a slim leather album. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but tonight, after the board's comments and Dr. Harmon's probing questions, something had shifted within him. The first photo showed a younger version of himself, arm wrapped around a beautiful blonde woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile. Sophia on their wedding day. He traced her face with his fingertip, remembering how she'd laughed when he'd smeared cake on her nose. He'd taken that picture himself, one of the rare evenings he'd made it home before dark. Alexander closed the album before he could see more, but not before a wave of long-suppressed emotion washed over him. What would the baby look like now? 9, almost 10 years old. Would they have his eyes? Sophia's smile? He returned the album to the drawer, locked it away, and with it, the questions he couldn't bear to answer. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria had been transformed into a glittering wonderland for the Children's Education Foundation's annual gala. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas. The city's elite moved through the space in designer evening wear, diamonds catching the light with each gesture. A string quartet played softly in the corner as waitstaff circulated with flutes of champagne and artfully arranged hors d'oeuvres. Near the entrance, a digital display showed the donation total climbing steadily toward the Foundation's ambitious 8-figure goal. Photographs of smiling children from the Foundation's programs lined the walls, their success stories printed beneath each image. At the reserved table nearest the podium, Brenda confirmed the final details with the event staff. Alexander's speech was scheduled for 8:30 p.m., following the Foundation director's introduction. His $5 million donation would be announced, photographs would be taken, and by 9:15 p.m., his driver would be waiting to whisk him back to his penthouse. Everything had been meticulously planned to minimize Alexander's time at the event while maximizing Pierce Innovation's public relations benefit. It was a system refined over years of charitable appearances, efficient, controlled, and entirely predictable. Or so they thought. Education is not just a pathway to success, it is the foundation upon which our future is built. Alexander's voice carried confidently through the ballroom, his delivery polished from countless similar speeches. He stood at the podium, the perfect image of corporate philanthropy in his tailored tuxedo. At Pierce Innovations, we believe that technology without education is like a vehicle without a driver. Powerful, but without direction. He paused at the practice moment, allowing for the appreciative chuckles from the audience. Behind his carefully composed expression, Alexander's mind was elsewhere, already reviewing tomorrow's agenda while his mouth delivered the memorized lines. The faces before him blurred into a sea of expressions he'd seen 100 times before: admiration, envy, calculation. That is why I am proud to announce Pierce Innovation's contribution of $5 million to the Children's Education Foundation Scholarship Fund. Applause erupted on cue. Camera flashes punctuated the moment. Alexander nodded acknowledgement, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Together, we can ensure that no child's potential is limited by their circumstances, he concluded, reciting the final line of the speech he had barely glanced at before approving. More applause. A standing ovation. Alexander gave a final nod before stepping away from the podium, already loosening his bow tie in his mind. As Alexander made his way back to his table, accepting handshakes and congratulatory nods, a flash of movement at the far end of the ballroom caught his attention. A woman with honey blonde hair pulled into an elegant updo was directing the catering staff, her back to him. Something about her posture, the graceful gesture of her hand as she pointed toward the dessert table, triggered a long-buried memory. Alexander froze mid-step, his practiced smile faltering. The woman turned, revealing her profile, and Alexander felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. 10 years had passed, but he would have recognized her anywhere. Sophia. Her features were more defined now, maturity having refined rather than diminished her beauty. The soft curves of youth had given way to elegant confidence. She was dressed in a midnight blue gown that accentuated her slender frame. Before Alexander could recover his composure, she turned fully and their eyes met across the crowded room. For a heartbeat, time suspended between them. Recognition dawned in Sophia's eyes, followed immediately by something Alexander couldn't quite identify, surprise, certainly, but also something harder. Before he could decide whether to approach her, the Foundation's director, Patricia Winters, appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Pierce, I see you've noticed our extraordinary event coordinator," she said, following his gaze. "Miss Sophia Bennett has completely revolutionized our fundraising approach since joining us 3 months ago. Tonight's gala is her creation." Alexander struggled to maintain his composure. "Bennett?" he repeated, the unfamiliar surname sitting strangely on his tongue. "Yes, she's brilliant," Patricia continued, oblivious to his shock. "We stole her from the Boston Children's Trust. She's the reason we're going to break our donation record tonight." The foundation director beamed with pride while Alexander absorbed the staggering revelation. Sophia, his ex-wife, was not merely attending the gala. She had planned it. The very event honoring him. Minutes later, Alexander found himself face-to-face with Sophia as Patricia enthusiastically made introductions, unaware of their history. "Ms. Bennett, I'd like you to meet Alexander Pierce, our honored donor tonight. Mr. Pierce, this is Sophia Bennett, the magical mind behind tonight's success." Sophia extended her hand professionally, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Pierce, the Foundation appreciates your generosity." Alexander took her hand, acutely aware of how cold and formal it felt compared to the warmth he remembered. "Ms. Bennett, the event is impressive." Patricia beamed between them. "You two speak the same language of excellence. I'll leave you to get acquainted while I check on the auction items." As Patricia walked away, an awkward silence descended. 10 years of unspoken words hung in the air between them. "Bennett?" Alexander finally asked, his voice lower. "My grandmother's maiden name," Sophia replied, her professional smile firmly in place. "I went back to it after the divorce." Alexander nodded, searching for something appropriate to say. "You look well." "Thank you." "As do you." Her eyes briefly flicked to his Forbes cover displayed near the entrance. "Success clearly agrees with you." "Sophia, She smoothly cut him off. "If you'll excuse me, I should check on the dessert service." "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Pierce." From across the room, Alexander watched Sophia as she moved through the gala with practiced efficiency. Her interactions with guests were warm yet professional, her smile appearing genuine to anyone who didn't know better. But Alexander could see what others couldn't, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she glanced in his direction. This polished, composed woman was a stark contrast to the passionate, open-hearted Sophia he had married. The woman who had once painted their apartment walls at midnight because the color feels wrong, who had danced barefoot in summer rain, who had cried openly during sad movies. that Sophia had worn her emotions like jewelry, visible, beautiful, unashamed. This new Sophia moved with careful precision, as if navigating a minefield. Her laughter seemed measured, her gestures controlled. She had built walls so high and so strong that nothing of the woman he had known seemed visible from the outside. Alexander recognized the strategy all too well. It was protection, a shield constructed from years of pain he had caused. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He had done this to her. He had taken someone vibrant and taught her to armor herself against vulnerability. During the auction portion of the evening, Alexander found himself seated beside board member Margaret Chen, who was bidding enthusiastically on a Caribbean vacation package. "Quite a successful event," he commented, sipping his barely touched scotch. "Indeed," Margaret replied, eyes tracking the bidding. Patricia was brilliant to recruit Ms. Bennett from Boston. The woman has connections throughout the East Coast philanthropic community. Alexander kept his expression neutral. "Boston? She's not from New York originally?" "Oh no, she built her reputation in Boston over the past 8 years. Apparently, she single-handedly transformed the Children's Trust there from a local charity to a regional powerhouse." Margaret leaned closer. "Patricia says she only moved back to New York 3 months ago when we offered her an executive position. Quite the coup for our foundation." The information settled uncomfortably in Alexander's mind. 8 years in Boston. That meant Sophia had left New York shortly after their divorce, after the twins were born. She had built a new life far from the city where they had once planned their future together. "Do you know why she decided to return?" he asked, trying to sound merely curious. Margaret shrugged. "Better opportunity, I assume. Isn't that why we all make big moves?" As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself repeatedly in Sophia's orbit. The Foundation's photographer insisted on capturing them together, the generous donor and the brilliant event coordinator, unaware of the crackling tension beneath their polite smiles. During the dessert service, Alexander was seated at the VIP table where Sophia needed to check on the special dietary arrangements. Their fingers brushed as she reached past him to adjust a place card, both of them flinching at the unexpected contact. "Sorry," she murmured automatically. "No, it was my fault," he replied, the apology extending beyond the small incident. The award presentation required them to stand side by side on stage as Alexander received a crystal plaque commemorating his contribution. Under the bright lights, he could sense Sophia's careful maintenance of distance between them, precise as a mathematician. At the bar, they reached for drinks simultaneously, creating another moment of awkward negotiation. "After you," Alexander offered. "Thank you," Sophia replied, her voice professionally pleasant but eyes averted. Each interaction was a masterclass in civility layered over unresolved history. To the casual observer, they were merely business acquaintances. But for Alexander, each moment near her was increasingly suffocating, filled with unspoken questions and unacknowledged regrets. As the auction concluded, Alexander spotted Sophia momentarily alone near the terrace doors. He approached, his heart inexplicably racing in a way it hadn't during billion-dollar negotiations. "The event is remarkable," he began. "You've done an extraordinary job." "Thank you," Sophia replied with that same professional smile that never warmed her eyes. "The Foundation appreciates your support." Alexander took a breath. "Sophia, I know this is unexpected. Seeing you after all this time." "Mr. Pierce," she interrupted smoothly, "I should check on the closing arrangements." Please, just a moment, he said, lowering his voice. I never expected to see you again. I've often thought about reaching out. A flicker of something, perhaps anger, crossed her face before disappearing behind her composed mask. That's not necessary. Our business concluded a decade ago. I handled everything poorly, Alexander persisted. The way things ended. The way you ended things, she corrected, her voice steady but with an edge of steel. And yes, you did. But that's ancient history now. She glanced at her watch. If you'll excuse me, the final donation tally needs my attention. Congratulations again on your company's success. Before he could respond, she had slipped away, leaving him holding words he'd never thought he'd want to say. Near the event's conclusion, Alexander was engaged in a conversation with potential investors when he noticed Sophia step away from the dessert table, her phone pressed to her ear. Something in her expression changed, the professional veneer softening into genuine concern as she moved toward a quieter corner. Alexander excused himself and discreetly moved within earshot, pretending to examine a display of student artwork. Yes, Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand, Sophia was saying, her voice gentle but worried. No, it's absolutely fine. Their health comes first. Yes, I can be there in about an hour. She listened for a moment, then continued, have they taken their medication? Good. Please tell them not to worry about the science project. We can work on it tomorrow? Yes, both of them need to rest. Alexander froze, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Thank you for looking after the boys on such short notice, Sophia continued. I know twins can be a handful, especially when they're not feeling well. Twins. The word echoed in Alexander's mind like a thunderclap. Don't worry, Sophia said, I'll pick you and your brother up from Mrs. Rodriguez's as soon as I wrap things up here. As she ended the call, Alexander stepped back, his world tilting on its axis. Twins. Boys. After 10 years, the realization struck him with staggering force. Alexander moved through the crowded ballroom in a daze, his eyes fixed on Sophia as she finished her call and headed toward the terrace doors. His mind raced with possibilities, each more disorienting than the last. The cool November air hit his face as he stepped onto the stone terrace. Sophia stood at the far end, her back to him, phone still in hand as she made another call. The city lights created a glittering backdrop behind her slender silhouette. Mrs. Rodriguez, sorry to bother you again, Sophia said, unaware of Alexander's presence. Could you check if Ethan took his allergy medication? He sometimes tries to skip it. And make sure Elijah actually goes to bed instead of reading under the covers. Each word twisted something deep in Alexander's chest. Ethan. Elijah. Names he had never heard before yet suddenly meant everything. He stepped forward, purposely making his shoes sound against the stone. Sophia turned at the sound, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness when she saw Alexander. She held up one finger in a just-a-minute gesture and turned slightly away. Yes, I promise I won't be too late, she continued into the phone. The gala is almost over. Don't worry, I'll pick you and your brother up from practice tomorrow as usual. Yes, both of you can have pizza after if you finish your homework first. She chuckled softly at whatever response came through the phone. I love you too, sweetie. Put Mrs. Rodriguez back on, please. In that moment, Alexander felt as though he was watching his life from outside his body. The tenderness in Sophia's voice, the casual mention of brothers, the easy "I love you," it was a glimpse into a family life that should have included him. A family he had dismissed a decade ago. A family he had never known existed. As Sophia ended her call, she turned to face Alexander fully, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Mr. Pierce, was there something else you needed for the foundation?" Alexander stood perfectly still, the question he needed to ask lodged in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnaturally quiet. "You have children?" "2 of them." The color drained from Sophia's face, her composure cracking for the first time that evening. She glanced at her phone, then back at him. "I heard you on the phone," he continued, taking a step closer. "Twins. Boys. Ethan and Elijah." Sophia straightened her shoulders, chin lifting slightly. "Yes, I have twin boys. They're 9 years old." "9," Alexander repeated, the math clicking into place with devastating clarity. "Born right after our divorce." The silence between them thickened, filled with 10 years of secrets and absence. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Tell you what, exactly?" Sophia replied, her tone carefully controlled. "That I have children," Alexander said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "That somewhere in this city, there are 2 boys who have grown up just fine without you," Sophia finished, her eyes flashing with protective fire. But then, something shifted in Sophia's expression, a crack in the carefully constructed armor she'd worn all evening. She looked away, toward the city lights, blinking rapidly. "They're not just my children," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the gala inside. When she turned back to face him, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "No, Alexander. We have children. Twin boys." The simple truth hung in the air between them, irrevocable and life-changing. "They have your eyes," she continued, a tremor in her voice betraying the emotion she was fighting to control. "And your stubbornness. Your analytical mind. Ethan can solve puzzles meant for children twice his age. Elijah has your focus when he's interested in something." She took a shaky breath, vulnerability showing through for just a moment before she visibly pulled herself together. "But they have my heart," she added softly. "Thank God for that." Alexander stood frozen, processing Sophia's words. The initial shock was quickly giving way to a burning sensation in his chest. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "You kept my sons from me for 10 years?" The question emerged as a controlled accusation, his business voice, the one he used when discovering someone had withheld crucial information. "I have 2 sons I've never met. 2 children who don't know I exist." His voice rose slightly. "You made that decision for them? For me?" Anger flashed across his features, not the calculated display of emotion he sometimes used in negotiations, but genuine, raw fury born of suddenly discovered loss. "Do they even know who I am? Or did you erase me completely?" Each question came faster than the last. "Did you tell them I abandoned them? That I didn't want them? What story did you create to explain my absence from their lives?" Sophia's composed demeanor shattered completely, years of carefully managed pain breaking through at once. "Don't you dare!" Her voice was low, but vibrating with intensity. "Don't you dare stand there and act like the wronged father. You gave up your right to them when you sent divorce papers to my hospital room while I was fighting to keep them alive." She stepped closer, eyes blazing. Do you even remember what you wrote in the note that came with those papers? For the best. That's what you said. I was hooked up to monitors, terrified I would lose our babies, and your response was to legally separate yourself from us. Alexander took a step back, the force of her words hitting him physically. The boys don't know you abandoned them because I never told them you existed in the first place, she continued, each word precise and cutting. What was I supposed to say? Your father decided his company was more important than meeting you? He was too busy building an empire to care whether you lived or died? She shook her head, a single tear escaping down her cheek. I protected them from the truth because no child deserves to know they were so easily discarded. That was my gift to them, and to you. A clean break. Alexander's anger dissipated, replaced by a cold dread as Sophia's words fully registered. What do you mean, fighting to keep them alive? Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, as if suddenly cold despite the mild evening air. The day after you said it would be for the best if we weren't a family, I collapsed in the nursery. Severe preeclampsia. My blood pressure was so high they thought I might have a stroke. Her voice grew quieter. The doctor said the extreme stress triggered it. Said I needed to remain calm for the baby's sake. A bitter laugh escaped her. Calm. While my marriage was ending and my husband was sending lawyers instead of coming himself. Alexander's face had gone ashen. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Sophia cut him off. The doctors gave the twins a 30% chance of survival if they were delivered immediately. 30%, Alexander. Do you know what that feels like? They were born at 32 weeks, Sophia continued, her gaze distant as if seeing back through time. Ethan weighed 3 pounds, 7 ounces. Elijah was even smaller, just 3 pounds, 2 ounces. Each one could fit in the palm of your hand. Alexander stood motionless, trying to absorb the information. They spent their first 6 weeks in the NICU. I was there every day, all day. Talking to them, singing to them, doing kangaroo care. Praying they would keep fighting. She looked directly at him now. Ethan had breathing problems. Elijah struggled to gain weight. There were nights the doctors prepared me for the worst. But they survived, Alexander said quietly. They more than survived, Sophia replied, a fierce pride replacing her sadness. They thrived. The doctors called them miracle babies. Every milestone they weren't supposed to reach, they reached it. Every challenge, they overcame it. Without you. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Can I at least know what do they look like now? Sophia hesitated for a while, before she then reached for her phone. After a moment's consideration, she unlocked it and scrolled through her photos. This was last month. Their school science fair. She turned the screen toward Alexander. The image showed 2 identical boys standing proudly beside a volcano project. Both had dark hair like his, slightly too long and falling across their foreheads. But it was their eyes, his eyes, that stole his breath. The same intense blue-gray that stared back at him from every mirror. One boy wore glasses and a serious expression. The other had a wide, confident smile that reminded Alexander painfully of Sophia. Ethan is on the left with the glasses, Sophia explained quietly. He's our thinker. Always analyzing, planning 3 steps ahead. Elijah is our creative one. More impulsive, but incredibly intuitive about people. She swiped to another photo, the boys in baseball uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, identical grins displaying missing teeth. "They're inseparable," she added. "Different personalities, but completely connected. They sense when the other is upset, even from different rooms." Alexander stared at the images, unable to speak, seeing 10 years of life he had missed displayed on a 5-inch screen. Alexander took a step back, his legs suddenly unsteady. He gripped the terrace railing, staring unseeing at the city below as the reality crashed over him in waves. He had sons. 2 of them. 9 years old. His mind, the brilliant, analytical mind that had built a tech empire, struggled to process this fundamental shift in his existence. For a decade, he had measured his life in acquisitions, innovations, and market share growth. He had defined himself by the empire he'd built, believing it was his legacy. But in an instant, that foundation had crumbled beneath him. What was Pierce Innovations compared to those 2 small faces looking back from Sophia's phone? What was a Forbes cover worth when set against 10 years of first steps, first words, first days of school, all missed, all gone forever? His carefully constructed world of achievement and isolation suddenly seemed hollow, built on a profound miscalculation of what truly mattered. "I didn't know," he whispered, more to himself than to Sophia. But even as the words left his lips, he recognized their emptiness. He hadn't known because he had chosen not to know. He had prioritized his empire over their existence. He had calculated wrong, and the cost was incalculable. "My beautiful family, seeing Alexander face the consequences of his choices makes me wonder about your own experiences. What would you do if the person that shattered your heart suddenly comes back asking for forgiveness? Would you let them back into your life, or you'll shut them off since they didn't know your worth when they had you? Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. While you're at it, don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying it. Your stories and perspectives help us all navigate these difficult crossroads of forgiveness, boundaries, and second chances in our own lives. Let's continue. "We shouldn't discuss this here," Alexander said, glancing back toward the ballroom where guests were beginning to notice their extended absence on the terrace. Sophia nodded stiffly. "I need to finish overseeing the event closure. My temporary office is down the hall. The foundation gave me use of it for the evening. We can speak privately there in 30 minutes. After seeing the last major donors off and instructing her staff on the final breakdown procedures, Sophia made her way to the small executive office at the end of the corridor. She paused at the door, straightening her shoulders before knocking. Alexander opened it immediately, as if he'd been waiting by the door. The temporary space reflected his permanent one, minimalist, ordered, with his laptop open on the desk and his suit jacket hanging precisely on the back of the chair. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. "I prefer to stand," Sophia replied. They faced each other across the room, 2 people who had once shared everything, now connected only by a secret neither had expected to confront tonight. "I have questions," Alexander said finally, his voice controlled but tension evident in the set of his jaw. "I'm sure you do," Sophia replied. "But so do I." "You think I didn't try to tell you?" she began, her voice quiet but intense. "After the twins were born, once they were stable enough to leave the NICU, I tried to contact you. Repeatedly." Alexander's brow furrowed. "I never received any. I called your office 17 times in the first month," she continued. "I sent emails, letters with photos of the boys. I even went to Pierce Innovations in person when the twins were 3 months old. She shook her head, the memory clearly still painful. I sat in your lobby for 4 hours with 2 infant carriers, waiting to see you. Do you know how difficult it is to keep premature twins calm in a corporate lobby? I had to nurse them both right there because they wouldn't stop crying. Alexander looked genuinely shocked. I never knew you came. No one told me. Of course they didn't, Sophia replied. Your gatekeepers were very effective at protecting you from distractions. Your assistant at the time, Janet, I think, told me you were building something important and couldn't be disturbed with personal matters, Sophia continued. When I insisted, she called security. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Janet followed my protocols. I had instructed her to filter all non-business communication. After that humiliation, I tried your lawyers, Sophia said. I thought they might be more professional, more reasonable. And? Alexander prompted when she fell silent. Mr. Goldstein informed me that all matters regarding our divorce had been settled and that you had generously waived all parental rights and responsibilities to allow me to move forward unencumbered. Her voice took on a bitter edge. He suggested that contacting you further could jeopardize my settlement. Alexander's expression hardened. Goldstein wasn't authorized to say that. Whether he was authorized or not, the message was clear, Sophia replied. You had built a perfect system to insulate yourself from complications. And your sons became complications. Or don't you believe me? Sophia asked, noting Alexander's skeptical expression. She reached for her bag, removing a slim portfolio. I documented everything. Partly out of frustration, partly because I thought someday the boys might ask questions. She laid it on the desk between them and opened it. Inside were meticulously organized records, printed emails with delivery failed notifications, certified mail receipts, handwritten call logs with dates and times, even a security badge from her visit to Pierce Innovations. January 15, 2014, she pointed to a receipt. I sent baby photos and birth certificates. February 3rd, I tried to schedule a meeting through your executive office. March 20th, the in-person visit. Alexander slowly examined each piece of evidence, his face growing more troubled with each one. I finally stopped trying after this, Sophia said, indicating the last item, a formal letter from his legal team dated 6 months after the twins' birth, threatening a restraining order for harassment of an executive officer. Alexander stared at the documentation, recognition dawning in his eyes. The systems he had created, the processes he had once been so proud of, had functioned exactly as designed. Too well, in fact. During those critical months when Sophia had been trying to reach him, he had been scaling Pierce Innovations, working 20-hour days, sleeping in his office. He had programmed his entire operation to eliminate distractions and maximize efficiency. The noise reduction protocol, he said quietly, almost to himself. What? Sophia asked. A system I implemented during our company's growth phase. All communication was filtered through layers of staff. Only pre-approved contacts or communications meeting specific business criteria would reach me directly. He looked up at her. Everything else was handled by others. Delegated. Disposed of. The weight of understanding settled on him. The same ruthless efficiency that had built his empire had systematically erased his family. His own sons had been categorized as non-essential communication and filtered out of his life. I built walls to keep distractions out, Alexander said, his voice hollow. I never considered what else they might keep out. Who else? The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. The systems that had made him a success had simultaneously ensured his greatest failure. Ethan and Elijah, Alexander repeated their names softly. You gave them my last name? Sophia nodded, her expression softening slightly. Ethan Alexander Pierce and Elijah Benjamin Pierce. Why? Alexander asked, genuine confusion in his voice. After everything, why keep that connection? It wasn't about you, Sophia replied simply. It was about them. About their identity. I couldn't erase half of who they are, no matter how bad I felt about you. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Alexander remembered from their marriage. Besides, Pierce is a good name. Your father built a respected legacy before you. Your grandfather too. That history belongs to the boys, even if you weren't in their lives. Alexander swallowed hard. And their middle names? Alexander after you, obviously, Sophia said. And Benjamin after my father. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, gratitude, perhaps, or the first recognition of the grace Sophia had extended despite her pain. Thank you for that, he said quietly. After the boys were stable enough to travel, I moved to Boston, Sophia continued. I had a college roommate there who offered her guest room until I could find my footing. She walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The settlement money helped initially, but I needed a career that would allow me flexibility for 2 babies with medical needs. Alexander listened silently as she described her path. I started small, planning fundraisers for my roommate's nonprofit. One client led to another. I worked while the twins napped, took conference calls with babies on my lap, pitched to clients with spit up on my blouse. A small, proud smile crossed her face. By the time the boys were 3, I had my own company, Bennett Events. We specialized in nonprofit fundraising. By 5, I had 2 employees. By 7, an office in downtown Boston and a client list that included 3 major foundations. Her voice softened. The boys came with me everywhere in those early years. They learned to sleep in portable cribs set up in hotel conference rooms. They colored quietly during client meetings. They grew up understanding what it means to build something from nothing. Alexander recognized the quiet pride in her voice. It mirrored his own when speaking of Pierce Innovations. Moving back to New York wasn't my plan, Sophia admitted. Boston became home. We had community there, stability. She traced a pattern on the desk with her fingertip. Then Patricia Winters approached me at a fundraising conference last spring. The Children's Education Foundation was expanding nationally, and they wanted someone to revitalize their donor program. The offer was too good to refuse, Alexander observed. Sophia nodded. Professionally, yes. Double my Boston salary, creative control, and a platform to help thousands of children. But personally, she hesitated. It was a difficult decision. The boys were settled. Moving meant new schools, new friends, new routines. What convinced you? Alexander asked. Ethan has a respiratory condition from his premature birth. New York Presbyterian has a pediatric pulmonary program that's perfect for his case. She met his eyes directly. Sometimes life brings you full circle for reasons you never expected. This was a chance to give the boys better care and advance my career simultaneously. Let me be absolutely clear, Sophia said, her voice taking on the firm tone Alexander imagined she used with the twins when setting rules. You cannot simply walk into their lives and announce yourself as their father. That's not happening. Alexander started to protest, but she held up her hand. The boys have a stable, happy life. They're thriving despite their challenging start. I won't allow anyone, not even you, to disrupt that stability. She met his gaze directly. If you want any relationship with them, it will happen on their timeline, not yours. And certainly not on the aggressive schedule you apply to business acquisitions. They're my sons, Alexander said quietly. Biologically, yes. But in every way that matters, emotionally, practically, you're a stranger to them. Her voice softened slightly. A stranger who shares their DNA and their last name, but a stranger nonetheless. What are you proposing? Alexander asked, his business instincts taking over in the face of negotiation. I'm not proposing anything, Sophia replied firmly. I'm establishing non-negotiable boundaries. If you want to know your sons, you'll need to earn that privilege. Slowly. On my terms. Starting as a friend, not as a father. If you can't accept that, then you'll have to forget about it. Central Park's Heckscher playground bustled with weekend activity. Children climbed, swung, and raced across play structures while parents clustered on nearby benches, chatting and keeping watchful eyes on their offspring. Alexander Pierce sat alone on a bench at the playground's edge, as out of place in this setting as a wolf among sheep. He had traded his usual custom suit for what his stylist had assured him was casual weekend wear, dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that still managed to look formal on his frame. He checked his watch, a nervous habit he'd never displayed in boardrooms or negotiations. 2:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the arranged meeting time. His right leg bounced slightly, another unfamiliar tell. A coffee cup cooled, forgotten, in his hand. He had barely slept the night before, reviewing everything Sophia had told him about the twins, their medical history, their personalities, their interests. He had prepared as he would for any critical meeting, yet felt hopelessly unprepared. Two women on a nearby bench glanced his way, whispering behind their hands. Alexander realized he must look suspicious, a tense, solitary man watching a children's playground. The thought almost made him smile. Alexander Pierce, Billionaire CEO, mistaken for a suspicious character while waiting to meet his own sons for the first time. At precisely 3 p.m., Sophia appeared at the playground entrance, a hand on each shoulder of two identical boys who vibrated with barely contained energy. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Even from a distance, the resemblance was startling. The twins wore matching blue jackets, but different colored hats, one red, one green, presumably to help others tell them apart. Both had Alexander's straight nose and determined jawline, though softened by youth. Their dark hair fell across their foreheads in the same way his did when he was their age. As they approached, one boy broke free, racing ahead toward the climbing structure. The other remained by Sophia's side, speaking earnestly while gesturing with his hands, a mannerism so like Alexander's that it felt like watching a miniature version of himself. Sophia spotted Alexander and leaned down, whispering something to the remaining boy. Both looked in his direction, identical blue-gray eyes, his eyes studying him with curiosity. The twin who had raced ahead returned at Sophia's gentle call. Both boys stood before Alexander now, mirror images in different colored hats, studying him with identical thoughtful expressions. Ethan, Elijah, Sophia said, her voice warm but careful. This is my friend Alexander. He works with Mommy's Foundation and helped us raise a lot of money for children who need special schools. Hello, Alexander said, his normally confident voice softened as he extended his hand formally. I'm Ethan, said the boy in the red hat, shaking Alexander's hand with surprising firmness for a 9-year-old. That's a strong handshake, he added approvingly. I'm Elijah, the green-hatted twin announced, giving a quick handshake before asking, Are you really a billionaire? Mom's friend Rachel said you were. Elijah. Sophia admonished gently. That's not polite. Alexander found himself smiling naturally. It's all right. Yes, my company has been quite successful. As the twin settled on the bench beside him, Alexander found himself unable to look away from their faces. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar pressure. Here, mere inches away, were two perfect combinations of himself and Sophia, living, breathing extensions of his DNA he hadn't known existed a week ago. Ethan's serious expression mirrored his own default state. Elijah's animated gestures reminded him of Sophia. Their voices, their mannerisms, the way Ethan furrowed his brow in concentration, all created an overwhelming sense of connection he had never experienced. For a man who prided himself on emotional control, Alexander was unprepared for the wave that crashed through him: recognition, wonder, grief for lost years, and a fierce, instinctive protectiveness that seemed to rewrite his understanding of himself in real time. These were his sons. The thought repeated in his mind, simple yet profound. Somehow, that fact changed everything about who Alexander Pierce understood himself to be. What exactly does your company do? Ethan asked, adjusting his glasses with a precise movement. Mom said something about computers, but I want to understand the specifics. Alexander found himself explaining quantum computing in simpler terms than he ever had before. Ethan listened intently, asking follow-up questions that revealed remarkable analytical thinking for a 9-year-old. So, your algorithms create pathways through quantum states to process information faster. Ethan clarified, his brow furrowed in concentration. Meanwhile, Elijah had already grown restless with the technical discussion. He was busy sketching in a small notebook he'd pulled from his pocket, occasionally glancing up to ask entirely different questions. Do you have a dog? I think everyone should have a dog. Although we can't because Ethan's allergic, Elijah said, showing Alexander his drawing, a surprisingly detailed rendering of the playground. Elijah won the school art contest 3 times, Sophia explained with a smile. And Ethan won the math Olympiad, Elijah added loyally. He's super smart. I'm the artistic one. He's being modest, Ethan countered. Elijah reads people better than anyone. He always knows when someone's sad or lying. Alexander watched the interaction with fascination, how they completed each other's thoughts, balanced each other's strengths, operated as distinct individuals who were nonetheless parts of a whole. As they walked toward the playground's climbing structure, the twins peppered Alexander with questions, their natural curiosity unconstrained by adult politeness. Do you have any kids? Elijah asked, skipping alongside him. Alexander glanced at Sophia, who gave a small nod. No, I don't have any children. That's sad, Elijah declared. Don't you get lonely? Before Alexander could respond, Ethan chimed in with his own line of inquiry. How many people work for you? Do you have a laboratory? Have you ever invented something that exploded? Around 12,000 people globally. Yes, several laboratories. And yes, In the early days, we had a few prototypes that overheated rather dramatically, Alexander answered, finding their direct questioning refreshing after years of carefully calculated corporate conversations. "Do you like ice cream?" Elijah asked, switching topics abruptly. "Mom says everyone has a favorite flavor. Mine's chocolate chip cookie dough." "I've always preferred vanilla," Alexander replied, surprised to realize he and Ethan had spoken the exact same words simultaneously. As the twins excitedly showed Alexander their favorite climbing structure, a troubling realization settled over him. For all his billions, for all his power and influence, he had nothing of true value to offer these children. He could buy them the world's most advanced computers, fund their education through prestigious universities, even purchase a private island for their entertainment. But he couldn't throw a baseball properly. He couldn't help with their science homework without turning it into a graduate-level lecture. He didn't know what books 9-year-olds enjoyed or what games they played. When Elijah asked if he knew how to make paper airplanes, Alexander had to admit he didn't. The disappointment on the boy's face stung more than any failed business negotiation ever had. His wealth, his achievements, his intellect, the pillars of his identity, meant nothing in this playground. Here, he was just a man who didn't know how to play, who had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, the language of childhood. While the boys were already climbing, the incident happened in an instant. Elijah, attempting to show off by climbing to the highest platform, lost his footing on the wet rungs. But Alexander saw it before it fully unfolded, the boy's grip slipping, his balance faltering. Without conscious thought, Alexander moved. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides and caught Elijah before he hit the ground, his arms instinctively cradling the boy's small frame against his chest. "I've got you," Alexander said softly, his heart racing as he set Elijah carefully on his feet. "Whoa," Elijah breathed, eyes wide. "You're really fast." Alexander knelt down, surprising himself as he automatically checked the boy for injuries. "Are you hurt? Move your wrist for me." He gently examined Elijah's arm, the protective gesture feeling somehow familiar despite being entirely new to him. "I'm okay," Elijah assured him with a grin. "Good catch, Mr. Alexander." Something fundamental shifted in Alexander's chest, a lock opening to a room he never knew existed. From the nearby bench, Sophia had watched the scene unfold. Her body had tensed instinctively when Elijah slipped, but Alexander had reached him before she could even stand. Now, she stared at her ex-husband with an expression of genuine astonishment. The Alexander she had known would have called for assistance rather than act himself. That man had been physically distant, uncomfortable with the messiness of human contact. Yet here he was, kneeling in park dirt, carefully examining their son's arm with gentle hands. When Alexander looked up and met her gaze, something unspoken passed between them. She nodded slightly, acknowledgement of a truth neither had anticipated. Despite everything, despite his absence and his priorities and his empire building, there was something innate in him that recognized his child. Something that had activated instantly in a moment of need. It was the last thing she had expected to see, and it complicated everything she thought she knew about Alexander Pierce. As their park time drew to a close, the twins gathered around Alexander one last time, their initial shyness replaced with the easy comfort children often develop with adults who take them seriously. "We're building a solar system model for school," Ethan explained, his eyes brightening with enthusiasm. "Not just the planets hanging on strings. Ours shows the actual orbital patterns and relative distances." "I painted all the planets," Elijah added proudly. "Even got the great red spot on Jupiter just right." Ethan nodded earnestly. You could come see it sometime if you want. Mom says you know a lot about physics. Yeah. Elijah chimed in. You could help us make sure the orbits are scientifically accurate. Alexander looked to Sophia, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected invitation into their lives. Maybe next weekend, she said quietly, surprising them all. If Mr. Alexander isn't too busy. I'm not too busy, Alexander responded immediately, the words feeling strangely liberating. We have to get going, Sophia announced gently. The boys have homework to finish before dinner. Alexander nodded, surprised by how quickly 2 hours had passed, hours that had felt more meaningful than any board meeting or business acquisition in recent memory. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Alexander, Ethan said formally, extending his hand again. Yeah. Thanks for catching me, Elijah added with a grin, offering a high five instead of a handshake. Alexander returned both gestures, committing to memory the feel of their small hands against his, the exact shade of their eyes in the afternoon sunlight, the particular cadence of their voices. As he watched them walk away, Elijah turning once to wave enthusiastically while Ethan discussed something serious with Sophia, Alexander felt an ache unlike any he had experienced before. 10 years. 3,650 days of first words, first steps, first days of school, all gone, irretrievable. The business empire he had built in exchange for those moments suddenly seemed like a hollow victory. What was Pierce Innovations compared to the sound of his son's laughter? What was $1 billion valuation worth measured against knowing his children's hearts and minds? They disappeared around the corner, taking with them a piece of Alexander he hadn't known was missing until today. Night settled over Manhattan as Alexander sat alone in his office, tie loosened, the city light spread below him like a reflection of the stars above. The space that had always felt like home now seemed strangely empty, echoing with questions he'd never thought to ask before. On his desk, his phone displayed photos Sophia had reluctantly shared, Ethan and Elijah at their last birthday, holding identical cakes. Their faces, his face, in so many ways, smiled back at him, unaware of the connection they shared. He replayed the day in his mind, Ethan's thoughtful questions, Elijah's infectious energy, the weight of Elijah in his arms when he caught him from falling. The instinctive protectiveness that had surged through him had been unlike anything he'd experienced before. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Alexander Pierce felt completely untethered from his understanding of himself and his place in the world. Alexander stood and walked to the window, staring at the Pierce Innovations logo illuminating the night sky from the building across the street. His empire. His legacy. The achievement that had defined him for a decade. The same achievement that had cost him his son's first words, first steps, first everything. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, studying the sprawling corporate campus he had built. Thousands of employees. Billions in revenue. Technological innovations that had changed the world. He had sacrificed everything for this vision, convinced nothing could be more important. Now, with the memory of two small faces fresh in his mind, the glittering empire before him seemed hollow. What good was revolutionizing quantum computing if he couldn't help his sons build a science project? What value was market dominance compared to the sound of his children's laughter? The truth hit him with devastating clarity. He had succeeded at everything except what mattered most. Alexander returned to his desk and opened his laptop. With decisive keystrokes, he drafted an email to his board of directors and executive team. The words flowed with unusual clarity. Effective immediately, I am restructuring my role as CEO to focus on long-term strategy and innovation. Daily operations will transfer to the executive leadership team per our succession planning protocols. He paused, then continued typing. This is not a departure, but a necessary evolution. For 10 years, I've neglected the concept of work-life balance. Recent events have shown me this approach is no longer sustainable or desirable. Alexander reviewed the message, knowing it would trigger speculation and concern among investors. For the first time in his career, he found he didn't care about the market's reaction. He had spent a decade building a company that could run without him. It was time to test that architecture, not for the sake of the company, but for something far more important. He clicked send. With the email sent, Alexander picked up his phone. He began typing, then deleted, then typed again, a rare instance of uncertainty for a man who composed messages with efficient precision. Finally, he settled on simplicity. Thank you for today. They're amazing. You've done an incredible job. His thumb hovered over the send button. The message felt insufficient to convey the earthquake of emotion the afternoon had triggered in him. How could he compress into a text what he was only beginning to understand himself? There was so much more he wanted to say. That he was sorry. That he had been wrong. That seeing her raise their sons with such care and wisdom made him understand the true meaning of strength. That the boys' brilliant minds and kind hearts were a testament to her, not him. But those words would come later, if at all. For now, this simple acknowledgement was all he could offer. He pressed send. Alexander had not expected a reply. He had set his phone down and was reviewing the company restructuring plan when the screen illuminated with Sophia's response. They haven't stopped talking about meeting you. Ethan is already researching your company's patents. Elijah wants to teach you how to make paper airplanes next time. Alexander read the message twice, warmth spreading through his chest at the thought of the boys discussing him. Then a second message appeared. They have baseball practice on Thursdays if you want to come watch sometime. For 30 at Riverside Park. Field 3. Just watching, no pressure. They don't know about everything yet. The offer was small, just watching a practice from the sidelines, but Alexander recognized it for what it was, a carefully measured olive branch. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but a narrow doorway through which he might begin to enter their lives. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed, "I'll be there." The following morning, Alexander called his executive assistant into his office. "Brenda, I need all Thursday afternoons cleared from my schedule indefinitely. Block them as unavailable starting at 3:30 p.m. Brenda blinked in surprise. "Sir, Thursdays are your standing meetings with department heads. And this Thursday specifically, you have the Tokyo investors and the Pentagon contract discussion." "Reschedule them all," Alexander replied calmly. "This is a standing personal commitment that takes priority." "A personal commitment?" Brenda repeated, clearly struggling to process this unprecedented directive. Alexander turned his monitor toward her, showing his newly reorganized calendar with Thursday afternoons marked in a distinct color. "This time is non-negotiable moving forward. The company will adapt." After Brenda left, still visibly confused, Alexander studied his adjusted schedule. For 10 years, his calendar had been a fortress, protected from all but the most critical business matters. Each minute had been allocated with ruthless efficiency toward company growth and development. Now, a 3-hour block each week would belong not to Pierce Innovations, but to 2 small boys who didn't yet know they were his sons. It was simultaneously the smallest schedule adjustment he'd ever made and the most monumental shift in priorities he'd ever committed to. This, Alexander realized, was just the beginning. That night, as Alexander reviewed acquisition proposals for expanding Pierce Innovations into new markets, he found himself unable to focus on the numbers before him. Instead, his mind returned to Ethan's serious questions and Elijah's bright smile. The revelation came not as a dramatic flash, but as a quiet certainty: no empire, no matter how vast or valuable, was worth the cost he had paid. 10 years ago, he had calculated wrong. He had invested everything in building a corporate legacy while neglecting the living legacy of his own children. He had prioritized creating technology that connected people across continents while severing the most fundamental connections in his own life. All his wealth, all his power, all his innovation, none of it could buy back a single moment of his son's childhood. Not their first words or first steps. Not their early tears or triumphs. Some costs, once paid, could never be recovered. Some mistakes could only be acknowledged and not repeated. The next morning, Alexander did something unprecedented. He took a personal day. Not for meetings or travel, but to prepare for Thursday's baseball practice. He began by purchasing books on child development and parenting preteens. He read about their developmental stages, their emotional needs, the importance of consistency and patience. He studied as diligently as he had when building Pierce Innovations, approaching fatherhood with the same dedication he'd given to business. He researched baseball rules and terminology, realizing he knew nothing about the sport his sons played. He watched videos of professional games, learning the difference between a slider and a curveball. When Thursday came, he arrived at the field 30 minutes early, dressed in casual clothes his stylist had assured him were appropriate. He sat on the bleachers, nervous in a way board meetings had never made him feel. As the twins arrived with Sophia, Alexander understood the fundamental truth of his new role. He wasn't entering their lives as an authority figure, but as a student. These boys didn't need a CEO. They needed someone willing to learn who they were, to appreciate what they loved, to earn their trust through consistency and care. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Pierce was starting at the beginning, with everything to prove. As weeks turned into months, Alexander adjusted to a new rhythm of life. Thursdays at baseball practice became Saturdays helping with science projects, which evolved into Sunday afternoon walks in the park. Each interaction taught him something new about his sons, and about the father he wanted to become. With Sophia, progress moved at a glacial pace. The cool politeness between them thawed only by degrees. At first, she would drop the boys off and leave. Later, she began to stay, watching from a distance. Eventually, they managed brief conversations about the twins' activities and needs. Alexander recognized that earning her forgiveness would be the work of years, not months. The hurt he had caused wasn't something that could be fixed with grand gestures or financial support. It required consistency, respect for her boundaries, and acknowledgement of her role as the boy's primary parent. In board meetings, Alexander had always demanded immediate results. But fatherhood operated on a different timeline. Trust had to be built through thousands of small moments of showing up, listening, and being present. The path to becoming the father his sons deserved and earning a place in their lives wouldn't be navigated through strategic planning or leveraged resources. It would be walked one day at a time, with patience and humility as his only guides. 3 months into their careful co-parenting arrangement, Alexander and Sophia found themselves alone on her porch after the twins had raced inside to grab their science fair project. "They're excited to show you the modifications they made," Sophia said, breaking the silence between them. Alexander nodded, noticing how the fading sunlight caught in her hair. "You've raised extraordinary children." "They are, aren't they?" A genuine smile softened her features. Their eyes met, holding for a moment longer than necessary. The practiced distance between them suddenly felt paper-thin. "Sophia, Alexander began. "Don't," she whispered, but she didn't step away. The air between them seemed to charge with 10 years of unspoken words and feelings neither had allowed themselves to acknowledge. Without conscious thought, Alexander reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. Sophia's breath caught. For a heartbeat, they remained suspended in the moment, then simultaneously moved toward each other. The kiss was gentle, hesitant, then deepened with a rush of familiar connection neither had felt in years. When they separated, Sophia's eyes reflected a storm of conflicting emotions. "This complicates everything," she whispered. "Or perhaps it simplifies it," Alexander replied softly, both of them aware that whatever path lay ahead had just shifted once again. 6 months after that first playground meeting, Alexander stood watching through the window as the twins played in Sophia's backyard. Their laughter carried through the glass, a sound he now treasured above all others. The journey was far from complete. There were still difficult conversations ahead, telling the boys the truth, navigating the complexities of their rekindled feelings, blending their separate lives into something new. But for the first time in a decade, Alexander felt he was exactly where he belonged. He had built an empire of technology, but had missed the true meaning of legacy until now. Looking at his sons, his brilliant, compassionate, extraordinary sons, he understood what truly mattered. Sometimes the most precious treasures aren't what we build, but who we build them with. And sometimes second chances come when we least expect them, but need them most. Alexander Pierce, the billionaire who had once sacrificed everything for success, had finally discovered the richest fortune of all. My beautiful family, as we come to the conclusion of this story, I want to especially thank you for joining me on this emotional journey today. Stories like Alexander and Sophia's remind us that it's never too late for redemption, never too late to recognize what truly matters in life. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Your support means everything to me and helps our family continue to grow. I read every single one of your comments, so please let me know your thoughts on today's story. Did it make you reflect on your own priorities? On second chances you've given or received? Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already so you won't miss tomorrow's special story that I've prepared with so much love for you. Until next time, remember that true wealth isn't measured by what we own, but by who we love and who loves us in return. I love you all so deeply.